Guys, welcome to this tutorial. We will talk about some of the very important technologies like what is an expression, what is a statement, what is difference between expression and statements, indentation and white spaces. So this is basically lecture for beginners who are completely new to programming. And sometimes people get confused with saying that, hey, some places have entered with a semicolon, somewhere have not entered semicolon, etc. So the kind of confusion arises. So I will try my best to solve the problem here. So when you end a statement with a semicolon, and what do you mean by a statement? A statement is a complete line of code that performs some actions. So that is what a statement is. If something is doing it, if it's a complete form of work. See here in this case, we have not entered a semicolon after this if block because it's not a completely statement. This whole thing makes it a statement. Right, so we have not entered a semicolon because it's still a continuation, because this if block is the starts here and finishes over here. So this itself is not this part, is not a part of the statement. That's why it's not ended with a semicolon. So this itself is a statement. That's why we have ended it semicolon, because it's doing something. What it is doing? It is displaying this thing on the screen. So we are using the system.debug because it is displaying something on screen. So it's a complete action that is performed. So that's why we have ended it with a semicolon. Now here, what an expression is. Expression is a section of code that evaluates to a value. So for example, in this case here, this num is equals to 100. It's an expression because it is an evaluating it to some value. Whereas this whole thing, integer num1, it is a statement because it does something, because it is assigning the value of 100 to this variable. So let's say it is a statement. Similarly, if let's say in this case, if I say is a is equals to b plus 1. Now in this case, b plus 1, this part of this thing is called an expression. Expression. But whereas this whole thing is called as statement. So statement will have expression. Statement will consist of expression. Okay. So whenever you write a statement, you have to end it with a semicolon. And what is an expression? Anything that any section of the code that evaluates to a value is called as an expression. A statement is a complete line of code that performs some actions. So that is the difference. Another thing is white spaces. So white spaces does not matter in program. Okay. So I could have written a equals to b plus 1, or I could written as a equals to b plus 1. So it's bad for readability purpose. It's a bad idea, but the white spaces doesn't matter. So what do I mean by that is, let's take an example here. So I go back to my developer console. So here, if I go ahead and write integer num1 is equals to 100, and without giving any space or anything, I go ahead integer num2 and I will create it as 80. So I have created two variables. One is called num1, the other one is called num2, and one is initialized with 100 and num2 is initialized with 80. Now I have given some space, and then I am going to go ahead and create another variable integer, and I am giving some space, integer num3 again, let's say 80 again. Okay, and then I'm giving some space and I have entered semicolon. So now it doesn't matter. Okay, so there is no error in this program. This thing is not going to complain. And if I go ahead and do system.debug, it is going to give me the correct answer. Num1, then I'm going ahead and display num1 value. Now, similarly, I copy this line. This is num2, num3, num2, and write it over here as well. And similarly, in the same line, I've added the second and third statement. So you are getting my point here. Integer num1 is equals to 100, num2 is equals to 80, and num3 is equals to 80 also. So I have added these spaces which doesn't matter. Your system is going to ignore it. You are not going to complain. This is the only spaces in the line. New lines that we give is only for our readability. Okay, so but if I go ahead and hit the execute button, you could not get any error. Your program will work as smooth as you think, and it's going to display num1 is 100, num2 is 80, and num3 is also 80. So this worked right. But this is not a good writing style. Okay, it's look better when you write in a new line. Okay, if you don't have unnecessary spaces. So here this is fine, and you can put in a new line for reading perspective. Then lot of times I have seen people do not use indentation, which is a bad practice. So for example, if I had written something like if num1 is greater than 100, I'm going to go ahead and say system.debug greater than 100, else system.debug less than 100. This is checking for 100 or less than 100. Okay. Now in this case, this is fine. This is not going to complain. Okay, we have written in a single line, which is fine, but it's not, doesn't look good, right? Because see, we don't need those curly braces, start and end of the curly braces, because there is only one statement after the if block, so that automatically becomes part of the if. Similarly, we have one statement in the else, because so it becomes the part of else. So now if I go ahead and hit the execute button, what is the value of num1? It is equals to 100, right? So we are checking if num1 is greater than 100. So this is false. So else block works, or we can say less than or equal. equal to 100. So in this case, the else block will work. So let's go ahead and hit the execute. It will not complain. It did not say, hey, you didn't write it properly. But looking at the code, it looks less readable. Okay, it's hard to figure out what you are trying to do. Whereas if you write something else, something like this, if num2 is greater than equals to 80 and you are proper giving this curly braces, and instead of writing everything in the same line, you give some indentation. System dot debug num is greater or equal to 80, else, and here itself I'm going to say system dot debug num is less than 80. It's going to give the result that num2 is equals to 80. So this block will get executed. But as reading perspective, it doesn't look good. It's better to write like this. This is indentation. So this looks more neat and clean rather than having no indentation. It's a very bad practice. So I always recommend you, when you are writing the code inside the blocks, you have to push little bit like this, like this. This is where the if block start. This is where the if blocks end. So it's more for the reading perspective. So if I go ahead and hit the execute, the output is going to be the same exact, no matter how you write it. But it's how it's make the difference for the next person who is reading your code, because it will be easy for him to read your code if you have used proper spaces, if you have used proper indentation. Variable names are very important. If you have just given a ABC, it's very hard to figure out what those variables are doing. But if the variable names are self-explanatory, that is a very good practice. It's always a good practice to write comments. Okay, if your code is doing something, if you are writing a logic, then you always good to add comments. So you can add either single line comments like this, or you can add multiple line comments like this. Anything you write between this becomes a multiple line comments. If you are using multiple lines, you can these comments. If you want to tell that what single line is doing, then you can use the single line comments. So let's meet in the next tutorial. I will see you then. Bye.